I think this is a very knowledgeable audience, so we don't really need to get into the details of the DPDP Act. The assumption that we are going to make is that more or less everybody here in this room has gone through the Act and its various versions over the many years, and you're reasonably aware of all the different aspects of this Act. So that is the understanding with which we will have this conversation. If at any stage any of you want a clarification on a specific point because you've probably missed that part, do seek it and we'll provide it. Otherwise, we will make that assumption, I think, in the interest of time. With that in mind, and keeping in mind that the three people in this panel know tremendous amounts about this, I would like to start with you, Gowree. This is an audience where there are, as I understand, a lot of data protection officers, compliance officers, lawyers, as well as quite a few marketers and advertisers. So with that in mind, what would be the critical nuances of the Data Protection Act as was finally notified that you think the audience needs to keep in mind with the rules still being framed?
I think, there are 5-6 items I want to call out. I think quite a few you have already called out in your presentation, so I'll not repeat them, but maybe give a perspective. So I think because this is a horizontal law, what we have noticed, especially during industry consultation vis-a-vis the rules, that different industry verticals, whether it is, from the brand perspective or otherwise, different, there are different perspectives. Right. So I think that is one area where I feel a lot of work requires to be done in terms of for each industry, what does it mean? Because it's a simple law, it is more complex in my view because of that. Secondly, even from advertisers' perspective, it's of course a PI law, which is a personal, information, and therefore anonymized data set, that one can sort of keep using, without any consent or otherwise. So I think that's one good thing that, of course, there is a non-personal data story, another story going out there. But at least for now, I think that is one good thing. The other important thing is, the data fiduciary is at the center in terms of liabilities. So therefore, in terms of, because what we have seen also that there are complex relationships, and in that, who is a data fiduciary in that relationship, that identification will be the key in terms of, sort of pinning the liability or at least compliance wise, right? The next point I want to call out, I think you've already done that, but we can no longer say that I don't know where the data is coming from or going, right? So especially in the cross-border, because you're in a cloud situation, right? And when you have these transfers, you have to be absolutely sure where is my data, and the data enrichment that the industry has been doing thus far has to be done much, much more carefully, and we will talk about it more when we are talking about specified consent. The other nuanced aspect is the consent manager, which again we will talk in more detail when we are talking about consent. The children's data, I think you've already mentioned. The last couple of things I want to call out is the specified purpose, especially from advertisers' perspective. When I want to call out what is the purpose for which I'm collecting data, and that also with the data minimization principle is going to be the key in terms of, all the legal heads, that we have to put across, on the table for this aspect. I think one important thing I want to call out, which is a positive thing, there is no criminal liability under this law, because earlier thought process and with the thought process of decriminalization of several statutes, that's a good thing. It is a penalty-based approach, but and the computation, etc. But that is one good thing. And the last point, which I feel will affect the industry in the Indian context, is we don't have a regulator who can keep giving you guidance. Right. So I think the industry will have to be proactive in terms of going out there, putting out their points, especially during the rule-making aspect. Right. I thought I'll just point that out as well.
Yeah, I think that sets the context for the rest of our discussion, because, as you rightly pointed out, there are several nuances in the way it will impact different, not just industries, within industries, different segments within the industry, the larger players, the small and medium enterprises, people who use existing large technology platforms and feed off it to build their products, each one of them, and in the context of when they become a data fiduciary, is a very crucial part of decision making from their point of view on what kind of consents they need to seek, how often they need to keep them renewed and things like that. But in that context, Bibhav, you represent, of course, one of the largest advertisers probably in this, at least in this country, but I also know that you have a keen interest in the overall data privacy, in the area of data privacy. From that perspective, the rules are yet to be framed. What kind of preparations are you as an organization taking? But also, more importantly, for the larger audience, what would be your suggestion in terms of what people should do, keeping in mind that some of the nuances are still not completely clear?
Thank you, Indranil. So what I'll do is that I think every organization is at a different maturity level currently. And what I'll do is that I'll maybe start with someone who's starting off preparing for the law. There are various organizations which are much more mature and would be dealing with the complex questions that Gowree just spoke about, which is still quite ambiguous. But if I see any organization of any size looking at this law, one of the things that the law is daunting is because it's ambiguous. And hence, whenever you come to a lawyer and ask for advice, it's always a if and but answer because they themselves do not know. So therefore, that makes it daunting. But I think how we should approach this law at the time being is that because it's already notified now, it's going to come. The regulations it may get delayed because of elections. So therefore, I think there are a couple of steps any organization can follow. The first and foremost would be executive buy-in. I think this has been a learning with Unilever that when you have executive buying, top-down approach, implementing and operationalizing privacy compliance or any kind of governance and compliance becomes easier. It also results in shared accountability on operationalizing a law of this nature, which is spread across. There is no one person within an organization who would understand and have an overview of the personal data processing footprint in any organization, unless it's a very small one-person organization, which can, with a very limited infrastructure, right? And hence, that executive buy-in is important to tell them. And one thing that the law does is the financial penalty of 250 crores does give you that voice in the board, in the management committee or leadership teams. The second approach is that once you've got the executive buy-in, is to identify a responsible team or person who's going to lead this. You need, while it's a shared accountability, there is someone who needs to be responsible for privacy and governance around personal data. It may be a legal team, a privacy legal team. There may be CISO's office. I've seen privacy-related governance being docked into different functions, and there's no right answer. It's about who has better visibility, better knowledge, and better maybe voice to get this operationalized, right? So therefore, that's the second thing, accountability on a team or a person who can drive this. The third one is mapping your footprint, which is the most humongous exercise if you're decentralized in terms of your processing. You need to have a core team, or at least whoever is accountable needs to speak to different verticals within functions, different functions, to understand what the footprint is. Because one of the things that at least we've realized is that there is no easy way. While we talk about Digital Bharat, digitization, there is no way a technology can tell me what all data does HUL have. I cannot do that. And hence, it's always been a journey. For the last 5 years, we've been on this journey. It's always been probing. We still learn that, this is also, that's something we are doing. Now let's start assessing it from a privacy impact perspective, right? So that's the third thing, once you have the footprint. Then comes the aspect on contextualizing the law, which I think you also spoke about. Because the law is ambiguous, I think it is very important on the person to understand the context in which the compliance come in. Not always will a consent be of a similar manner. And hence, I think having that hold on the context of the law or the use cases in which your organization approaches and the impact to it is the last one. Then I think once you've done that, one of the only, I think there will be steps for all the compliances, but one of the things that at least every organization should look at is that, like cybersecurity, privacy should be a risk-based approach. Just to give you an example or analogy today, when I am an organization who is collecting consumer data and monetizing it versus data of your employees, if you have to choose and you have to choose investment around technology, investment around managing it, I think that's how you should do it. Because if you see even more mature jurisdiction like Europe, where GDPR has been there for 5 years, they're all learning. And I think I think we shouldn't be worried about the ambiguity. We at least should take the first step towards compliance in this manner. I think the other compliances, I don't want to bore the audience. We can talk about it as we move forward.
No, absolutely. And I think, Ashish, You represent NASCOM, which is an industry body of which many of our organizations are a part of, and different scales and sizes. So makes it even more complex because when Bibhav talks about 250 crores for many organizations like ours, that's many years revenues that we are talking about. So when NASCOM is dealing with the government, with the industry, what are your experience so far? What is the view that the technology companies of different scales and sizes taking towards the DPDP Act, and what are you doing to assist them with the process of implementing it?
Thanks, Indranil, and very glad to be here. See, the law got enacted in September, right? And since then, we have had many conversations with the industry in terms of saying that now the law is finally here. And as we were just said, I think two things which industry needs to do and is doing is one, just figure out where all the personal data is, because it's not just about the large enterprises, but even for the SMEs and startups, it is not very clear in terms of where exactly the data is, what are the guardrails, how is that managed well. Second is to also understand for the first time that there is this legal basis that you need to now account for processing the personal data, and which is largely going to be consent. So I think that understanding and then putting that into some kind of a process going forward, for that you don't need to wait for rules largely. You need to make that process happen. So I think that's one area. Second is also that this law requires that consent can be withdrawn and then the data has to be deleted. So a lot of companies haven't thought about that as a process. And I think putting that into a process will take time. And while we wait for the rules, I don't think it stops companies from embarking on the journey. So just for example, we as NASCOM, we run a future skills platform for industry.
Right.
It also, we launched a future skills prime recently. So about 5 months back, we sat with them and we were rolling out an RFP so that we get the consultants and experts to come in and help us to say that how do we do all this exercise, and also then how do we think of liability management, because part of the platform is outsourced to a third-party organization which is actually doing the work. We are an industry association, we are driving it, but we don't do the actual work. So how do we do all of that? So I think this is just one way of understanding what we are doing. In December, the government did a Digital India dialogue where we got a preview of rules at some level to say that now how the government is thinking about the rules. And I think one of the things is that industry always expects utmost certainty to have things in black and white. And sometimes when they get it, they also say it is very prescriptive. And they want flexibility. And when they have uncertainty, presumably there is some flexibility, but then that's also complicated because it puts you in a difficult position. So I think what we need to do is to strike a balance. So the conversation largely from an industry point of view is that at this point in time, you need to show intent and work in that direction. The worry at some level is that because of the structure of the law, you don't want a situation where you learn by getting a rap in form of a penalty from the redress board. That's a very expensive way of learning. And I think if we can if the government can issue guidances for which there's no scope in the law, but government can potentially issue guidance to government itself. And we can take as a proxy, okay, you have done similar stuff for government, we are just following that, and then we get a little more comfortable. And then, of course, we can take references to what is being done in GDPR, because in substance, in a lot of areas, our law is not so different, and all of that. So I think there is a lot that can be done, and that's what we are assisting the industry with. At a larger level, I think if you just focus on this idea of advertising and marketing, there is so much of value creation that has happened in the internet. Not only the DigiYatra example you mentioned, but also free lot of stuff, right? And when I say free, I'm talking about the money part of free. And I think that's the value creation at certain level. So you talked about penalties. So recently in Europe, every other day there is some $1 million fine penalty, right?
Right.
And kind of you get used to those numbers. It looks normal. But I think increasingly the debate is that, okay, either you're going to have that ad marketing supported free model, or you will go to this consumer paying paid model.
Right.
And that's a big debate. And I think as a extreme outcome, if we are all forced to move towards that model, then I don't think that is something it is in interest of the consumers or the industry. So I think how do we strike that balance that we continue to be in this kind of a free model with the right safeguards,
Right.
and that would be a great implementation of this law. And I think that's the conversation.
Right. No, that's extremely valuable, especially since you brought in the conversation towards the experiences of Europe and GDPR, and I think Bibhav mentioned that as well. That they have been on a 5-year-long journey. I think there is a fair amount that we can learn from there. Of course, there's hopefully not the zillion $1 million penalties, but all the other aspects that they've been learning from. So in that context, and I'll come to you, Gowree, first. What could be the key learnings of for the DPDP Act's journey over the next, let's say, the next 5 years? Because I sincerely hope that there aren't real penalties imposed right up front. It's more likely to be directives which go out to different organizations on behavioral patterns, which is probably the more likely journey. But keeping in mind that even GDPR gave most organizations time to set their house in order, what do you think directionally would be the lessons from GDPR for the DPDP Act?
I think the first one you already called out, and that's, I think, on top priority, is the timeline given, right, to the industry, because they already had a certain detailed framework. They just enhanced it with GDPR, right? So even then the 2 years timeline was given, right? So I think that itself is a good learning. The second learning is a change in mindset takes time. Right. So it's not that even if that was an advanced, economy or mindset and all of that, even then it took some mindset change, sort of time for that. So keeping both these in mind, that is number one. Second, I've already called out, but I think if you see the GDPR and I've seen, they have very extensive advisories issued. And the point which I made before, with going into each nuance is that, okay, if the consent is on IVR, then what happens and things like that. Now, unfortunately, in the Indian context, we don't have a regulator, we have a board just to impose penalties. So I hope that, we have something within the ministry, some setup which can sort of do that, back and forth, without which it's especially in the Indian context, when you have such vast, sort of, different, people are at different level of maturity. So that is the second, learning. The third, which I again called out, but want to call out, that industry specific nuances will be also part of these conversations. And I'll give an example that when we were doing the rule specific, for the industry consultation, about 140, across different industry had joined, and each one had such different thought process. The healthcare industry had their own sort of, things, because I'm going to somebody's house, taking blood and, signing and things like that. And then I'm digitizing. So each one had their own thing to say. So I think that is somewhere I feel, if there are any learnings in that context, industry specific, that is one thing we can take up. And the last quick couple of things is, the data transfer also there. I think they took some time to figure that out, right? So can we figure that out in advance rather than later? Right. So I think, and of course, the other things have been called out, the investment, that is required, time, money and resources for implementation purpose, then product and process changes, time required for that, right? So from an implementation perspective, I believe these are the things I want to call out. Yeah.
Sure. And, so Bibhav, your journey is a journey where GDPR was already a part of your lives when the DPDP Act came into existence. As an advertiser, and keeping in mind that this community is largely an advertising community, what has been the challenges to prepare when compared to GDPR? I'm sure the fact that you were already prepared for GDPR helped in your preparation for the Indian piece. But what were the challenges that you faced, and through that, what were the key differences that you realized between implementation of GDPR and implementation of the DPDP Act?
So I think we're still on a journey towards compliance. We all are. I'll take a couple of challenges that we've faced and how we've approached it from a advertiser perspective. First of all, I hope that the regulator would have a more collaborative approach during their enforcement, and all of those learnings that we've had it's more experimental.
So I think Gowree also mentioned, so we recognize that the Data Protection Board is primarily a penalty imposing authority, but we are hoping that at least the DPDP Act was started in the right way by putting in illustrations as a part of the Act. Hopefully, with time, with more experiences, the number of illustrations that come into the DPDP Act will increase, and in that process, probably form the journey forward. We are hoping.
I would hope so. I have a different point of view on the illustrations. They are actually more restrictive and confusing, to be very honest. But I think if they go the way Europe has gone with respect to guidance and detailed guidance, contextualizing that guidance is what is required, not one of three, a para example, because that puts in a lot more ambiguities and questions for operationalizing compliance.
They're very simplistic. I mean,
Absolutely. So I think that collaborative approach is definitely necessary. Now, when it comes to advertising, one of the things that we've struggled with is trying to map our footprint of personal data of consumers. We operate in a manner, we're not a digital first brand or organization. We operate with 400 plus brands across the globe. So, and then with every brand having their own marketing strategy, plans, consumer reach out plans. So therefore, we are quite decentralized in terms of operations when we use personal data. And every organization will have its own problem. When it's a small organization, you'll have all data sets in a limited infrastructure, better visibility, but you'll be crunched for resources, maybe money, etc. So every organization will have their own problem and needs to sort out. But for us, it was mapping that footprint, trying to get a sense of where all is the data. The reason being, I think there are two things that I've understood, or I think is primary importance for any organization to understand, is that any data protection legislation, there are a couple of things. There are two things that there. One is transparency. That's the foremost, transparency to the consumer. The other is control of the data to the consumer, at least from an advertising point of view. And how that can be implemented is when you have overall visibility of your data. Tomorrow, when a consumer wants to opt out of something, I should ensure that as Unilever, I'm able to opt them out of a communication, whether it is Brew sending them communications or a Lakme sending them communications. Or at least I have a preference center which allows them to choose separate brands, because one of the things that people love to collect data, marketers, they would love to collect data at an enterprise level, but would not want them to opt out, right? So therefore that control, so contextualizing those compliances would also mean that when you look at you've taken an enterprise consent from a consumer, which is basically taking consent for all the brands that an organization operates in. You also need to give the flexibility of withdrawing consent at the same level. However, if you want to make it practical for the business, if I have to contextualize this compliance, how I would approach it is that maybe, okay, I don't want them to opt out of the brand. The consumer may be wanting to opt out because she or he doesn't really like the brand that is communicating with him. So give a preference center of sorts to opt out. So that control is required. So one of the things, foremost challenge for any brand operating at a large scale is the footprint. Then comes the aspect that I just touched on. I think privacy compliances needs to be contextual. I think there is no black and white compliance, and therefore always I think a good privacy advisor would be someone who can contextualize the business operations, right? And operationalizing compliances in a manner which does not disrupt or is detrimental to consumer experience as well as operations. So the first one is with respect to footprint. The other aspect is visibility. So what we've done, and to address this, is started standardizing infrastructure and activities. So to give an example, we have an entire consumer tech infrastructure that we've built along with the team, which basically has centralized consumer reach outs, marketing activities. What it does is it gives us better control. While we're not a digital first brand, it's an attempt for us to do it in that manner, create an ecosystem. So we have a database, identity and access management system for consumers so that easy opt-outs are possible. Because if I have data lying with every brand and a consumer wants to opt out, it becomes impossible to operationalize it. We have done pilots around it. So centralizing that so that at a click of a button, a consumer can opt out. We are working towards a preference center, which a lot of mature brands like Google, Meta and all already have. We are trying to move towards that. So I think those things would come about. But if I have to generalize what the advertising industry may face or what consumers would benefit out of is twofold. One is transparency. People will get to know as to what's happening or where or what advertiser is doing with the data. The second is control. I think today, while we have D&D regulations around it, I think opting out of that is something we've all experienced. We still get property-related SMSs and calls day in and day out. I think this would, with the regulator coming in force, will give better control to consumers. I have an opportunity to escalate to a regulator, which basically puts an organization on their toes to really fulfill. And we've seen examples in Europe. A grievance redressal not being met can result into an investigation in a completely different direction, like what happened with Carrefour in you.
Right. So 2 points that come out from whatever we have discussed till now. One is, in the context of consent, the DPDP Act actually requires you to look at all the retrospective consents as well, which for all sorts of organizations is going to potentially be a big challenge, because and within reasonable time review those consents, make sure that the purposes have been limited. So that has to be a challenge. And the other part of the DPDP Act is, it says that the opting out process, like the GDPR does, has to be as simple as the opting in process. So if you could opt in by sending yes or a Y on a SMS, you should be able to opt out by sending an N on a similar SMS. So those are challenges. And I'll come to you, Bibhav, because I'm sure your organization is dealing with that. But I'd like to start by asking Ashish from a NASCOM perspective, because there are lots of small and medium enterprises which also have been, for example, in many cases, they are not necessarily in their mind data fiduciaries, because they have ridden on a Google or a LinkedIn profile to build their individual profiles or their consumer profiles or user profiles. How are they planning to deal with this opt-in, opt-out question, or the question of retrospective consent? Because in many cases, there was no consent, because they were actually sitting on top of another platform which they expected had taken the consent already.
Yeah, interesting. So over the last few months, we have had conversations with aggregators, social media companies, e-commerce platforms, and all of that, and other different kind of companies who are probably publishers. So one, I think, simple step and important step is that you need to relook at your contracts, because if you take a typical social media model, the interface is the user with the social media platform. The advertisers are coming in from backend to say that we want to reach out to this audience. So presumably, in a simple use case, then it is the platform which is taking that consent from the user and managing that consent. But you could also be a large enterprise like, let's say, Unilever, who already has its own database. And then for that, they are the fiduciary and they have taken the consent. And then there might be certain data enrichment where you collaborate with the social platform and say that, okay, let's do this. So I think a lot of this is about saying that for the data that for which you are determining the purpose of processing, you are the fiduciary, and understanding that and that getting reflected into contracts is a base. When I say basic, relatively the easier step. Once you go past this, I think the first important point then to realize is that when you think of advertising and marketing, given the jurisprudence, the way it has developed in Europe, while we have a legitimate use case under which there is a voluntary provision of information, but that's not going to cut it most likely from a point of view of advertising marketing. So you're only left with consent. And then when you think about it, as a company, what are the tools? So one, definitely, I think the platforms will do the heavy lifting in some of the cases. Then you're seeing operating systems doing the heavy lifting. So for example, the iOS and the Android, they will, because on the device, they are the entry point. So they are the one who will then take user consent and provide a privacy dashboard and all of that and enable. And then on top of it, I think contractually, the apps and service providers will be able to work on top of it. Similarly, browsers will be a kind of a pit stop for privacy dashboard, where when you're installing the browser is one will get those permissions and settings and say that, okay, fine. And that's how the legal process will work. One of the big challenge which I think we should think about is that what is different between GDPR and our law? While there are many differences, I think from an advertising point of view is that we have a very clear provision which says that you can't have behavioral monitoring and targeting advertising for children. So as soon as you do that, that directly impacts, or it intersects with advertising. And therefore, what it also means as a corollary is that you need to know that the person is an adult or a child. So you need to know if somebody is an adult, and that itself requires some information. So one of the exemption that you would expect is that the processing that is required to identify somebody as a child or adult would be exempted, and I think that should come through. I'm hoping that as an exemption of that itself. And once that also comes in, I think so let's say a gaming company. Now, there could be a presumption that games are largely targeted to kids. And that would be a presumption which a gaming company probably would need to take in. And then once you are a gaming company and then you want to do behavioral targeting, then either you could go to the government and prove that you are verifiably safe, or you put in those processes, you demonstrate and you put that claim up front. Or you go down the route of having solid consent, but I think even unless you have an exemption, then consent doesn't work, at least for children. So I think a lot of these things are something which companies are examining right now. They are looking at it. And on the first point that we discussed, I think as NASCOM, we have a sister organization called Data Security Council of India. So what they're doing is they are running programs for certification of data protection officers. And this is a program which is targeted both at SMEs and startups and all of that. So a lot of people are joining because that's this cadre of people who are especially looking at personal data protection is not necessarily big in India at all. And both from enforcement side and the industry side. It is not that in the government there are people who are sitting who are experts on data protection. So I think it's kind of both evolving, and that's what I agree with what you said in terms of, it has to be a collaborative approach. And also, I think initially the redress board, it also has a power to issue directions for specific steps to be taken to remedy the, rather than necessarily living penalty.
Which is probably what they will do, for at least for the first couple of years. That's the expectation of the industry, yeah.
So I think in substance, from an advertising point of view per se, there is also this idea of, this is just the last point on this, is the idea of tokenizing consent. So recently you must have read in Europe, the telcos came together to create a merged entity between Deutsche Telekom, Voda and Orange and so on and so forth, that they will put together a digital identifier basis which people will be able to target, advertising, so that you skip this problem of identity. Similarly, there is, I think, Google, which is looking at saying that how can we shift from identity to activity? So once a person is browsing about something, then you focus on advertising at that point about that activity rather than the identity of the person. So I think various models will develop, and while it's a journey, it might take a couple of years for things to settle down. But I think largely, if you look at our law, even the rules, at least the preview which I talked about, I don't think they are going to give you very good clarity in terms of being detailed. So I think you still need, even with the rules, you will need to make a lot of judgment on your own. So it is better to step into it rather than wait for some perfect clarity is what I would advise.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So I think I want to add a few points to what both of them have said. I think number one, in the Indian context, and I'm just going very legal, words that have been used, is informed. Right now, when you say informed, we have so much public out there who are not literate. They are doing the payments with voiceovers and things like that. So I think some novel thought process will be required as to how do I obtain consent, in the Indian context, especially across the board. I think that is point number one. Point number two is on the children's data. I think that the point that you made, because it says parental consent. Right now, I believe and I hope that the government, the way they have come out with such good digital public infrastructures, that there is some digital public infrastructure mechanism which is at the back end to give these parental consents, because each platform developing the identification, then top of that doing that parental consent, whether I have to do email consent, I have to do SMS, whatnot. So I think if some common method can be developed, that is point number two.
No, in the good old days when it was non-digital, we used to fake our parents to get our report card signed. Now people will start faking their parents to get digital consent to do gaming, for example.
You are already noticing so many cases where credit cards have been used by children, right? And they have done the gaming and whatnot, right? So I think that is point number two. quick point number 3 is the exemption that you mentioned, which is especially those who are in the audience. Section 9 gives out, some possibilities of exemption. So I think the industry should, proactively talk about those exemptions and work with the government. I think the last point on the withdrawal, right, especially for when the brands or the platforms, the provisions that we have for withdrawal and deletion, they say that there is an assumption that you will have to delete the data if they have not connected I'm just putting it simplistically. Now there are so many of products, right, which are very like Diwali specific or Christmas specific outreach programs. Now if the brand or the consumer has not connected with the brand, right, for that, and to what Ashish said, if the platform, the social media platform is the connect, that is one. But if the brand is the connect and they have not connected with that particular brand, how the interpretation is going to be, we don't know. But then if there is a deletion, that means I will not get those good offers, Diwali offers coming my way, right? So I think some of these elements on a practical level have to be thought through when we are looking at some of these deletion related provisions and the like.
Right. And the point you make about the fact that there's a large part of India, where consent is really not informed by virtue of the fact that in many cases they're not aware about how to give informed consent, and the Act actually uses very specific words about what will constitute informed consent, which makes it difficult for a large section of the audience to really ever confirm that they've given informed consent. But in that context, I would like to bring in the concept that, two concepts actually, primarily from a small and medium enterprise perspective. One is the concept of the consent manager. Now, there is, again, a fair amount of ambiguity, like with most aspects of the DPDP Act, on who exactly can be a consent manager. You have to register yourself, is the one thing that is clear. But how are you people viewing the consent manager in HUL, by NASCOM, and of course as a lawyer, Gowree? So I'd like to come to all of you on your view of what would be the ideal construct of a consent manager.
So I have limited information around it. I have not understood the concept because of the ambiguity. One of the things that I foresee as a problem is that they've actually tagged consent manager vis-a-vis the data principal with completely ignoring the data fiduciary's role in managing consent, withdrawing consent. They also talk about an interoperable platform, which I do not know, as in I've spoken to a lot of people, tech organizations who are working towards or wants to do something very similar to account aggregators under RBI. That's what they were envisioning, at least when they said consent manager. And this is something completely new. I have not seen it across, whether in GDPR or any other regulation. So I have limited information. However, because we've spoken to a lot of people, one of the things that they've said is that operationalizing consent manager framework is going to be a task. It's going to be a task. It'll take a while. There needs to be a completely overhaul or a new novel ecosystem that can manage, because the value chain of data, especially in advertising cross, it's not possible to have consent flowing in, and that's what we've realized. What we are doing now is we're ignoring the part about consent manager till it comes, and we're trying to see that whether it is a consent manager which is devoid of or agnostic of the data fiduciary comes to me, if I'm able to redress or action that query, grievance, right, that the data principal has. That's how we're looking at it, because right now, I think we'll be second guessing. We are not an organization that specializes in that kind of technology. But what we've heard from people who've been or trying to understand this better to be a consent manager, they've also found it difficult to understand from MeToo as to what really would be the infrastructure and framework. So therefore, we are currently actually creating our consent management agnostic of a consent manager. That's the easiest way. As Ashish mentioned, we're not waiting for the rules to clarify. We're just doing our part to build that trust with consumers. As someone put in, or not put in today, but I heard a line in one of the talks earlier that if data is the new oil, trust is the currency. So that's what is the principle, and you build on that and do everything to build that trust with the consumer. And that's how we're approaching even the consent manager. So
Ashish, if there are consent managers, which hopefully there will be, they're likely to be NASCOM members. So have you had any any queries on somebody wanting to be a consent manager and trying to understand the concept better? Have you had any interactions with policymakers on what would be the ideal consent manager construct?
Yeah. So one problem we don't have is the tech industry growing. So that is definitely. But so I think we are a little more positive about the idea of consent manager. It need not be a very centralized thing. It is about saying that how can we unlock not just Aadhaar but DigiLocker and let people connect to it on a what do you call the zero trust or something, where you don't necessarily pass the information but you just get a answer that somebody is adult or not. And I think given our own, I mean, 10 years back, we would have said government has no business to be in business. But then you have a fairly good success on DPI. So then you can, okay, fine, some of these things can actually work and work well. So I think there is, it will happen. But again, it won't happen on day zero. So I think we will need to slowly progress into this. Regarding the business model, I think that's a bit of a challenge. We have seen it in the payments industry more generally. The MDR got killed pretty much, and then payment industry had to reinvent. It took a lot of time, and still it's a bit of a challenge. So who are these agencies who will in private sector put their hands up and say, I want to be consent manager? It's not very obvious today. So, but I think there are a lot of people who could do this. Like people who are doing OS, they are very good candidates for doing some of this stuff, right? So I don't see this idea of one consent manager. I think initially we started with consent manager as an activity, thinking of it as an activity. But I think now seems like it has to be an entity which has to be carved out and all of that based on the law. So yeah, I think this is one thing which, again, from an India point of view, could be a game changer, and making it really good can be something which will be good for the industry.
Maybe there is still an opportunity, and I know that some of you have had a sneak peek at the rules or a version of the rules. There are some floating around in the public domain which have been told are fake. But keeping in mind that they're still not out there officially in the public domain, if you had an opportunity to provide some inputs on the rules, what would they be? I'll start with you, Bibhav, and I'll end with you, Gowree.
So I'll limit it to a couple of points. There's a wishful list that we have as an organization, but I think one of the primary ones is, I think, an adequate transition timeline, something that Gowree touched upon. Even developed markets like Europe who've had regulations since the 1980s required 2 years and are still learning. So therefore, a nation like ours will definitely need more time, and hence that transition period is something that we're really looking at, a more practical one rather than a 6-month period that they are looking at. That's one. The second is data breach. With respect to data breach notifications, if you see the current legislation, it does not provide the threshold approach that GDPR does. And the worry that I have, I'm hoping that that is something that gets clarified in the rules, because the way the provision is crafted today in the Indian legislation, it requires every breach to be notified to the consumer or the individual as well as the regulator. It's not an ideal scenario, not because organizations want to hide breach notification. It's about making the administration of such breach notification by regulators easy, as well as not to create a state of panic amongst data principals in a lot of cases. So therefore, that's the second one. The last one would be a bit of clarity on the requirement of 22 languages for consent and notices. That's a tall ask for organization like ours, which operates in different states with people differently. So changing privacy notices. And then the other problem is that I don't know, we don't have bespoke notices for consumers. We have a plethora, and then it's across all organizations. You have all the specified purposes in the notice. My worry is that tomorrow, if they say that you need to have bespoke notices, specified purpose means only one purpose. Having the capability of changing consent or translating consent into different languages is something that
we lost in Google Translation. No?
Yeah, we hope we're hoping that. Otherwise, Bhashni is what I'm looking at. They're using AI to really change the landscape. So I'm hoping that would be open to the world, and they also will at least bear in mind that there will be certain fallacies or issues and errors in translation, and to consider English as the primary notice for the organization.
Right.
So I think these are the three ones. I think there'll be more.
Ashish, over to you.
So I'll second all of those points. I think one is that when you want to come out with rules or notices and all that, it should not be prescriptive. Just keep it in terms of outcomes, that plain language, simple, that kind of stuff. I think one of the things we didn't talk about, I think the redress board, it is supposed to be digital by design. So how it can actually be digital by design in a manner that it is both industry ease of doing business and consumer quick outcomes. And I think the appeal also will go to this TDSAT, right? So they will need to have a shift in their mindset to from what they're doing to accommodate this, and they will also need to be digital by design. So all of that will really help if that is done well for industry to kind of sail into this little more. And I think rules are pretty much final. That's what I understand now. Whether they are going to have any last minute changes or anything before they're released for discussion, and they should provide adequate time for discussion also. Yeah, but that will be good.
Sure.
So I think before even the rules come in, my wish list is that there should be a good FAQ in terms of clarifying some of the positions, because all of us have said that the law is quite vague at places. So if the industry can get guidance in terms of FAQ, because as all of us will know that the act will not be amended through the rules. Whatever is written in the act, is there, right? Unfortunately, the breach point that he mentioned, I echo it, but the act doesn't provide. So I don't think rules can provide for that. So I think, therefore, good clarity in terms of FAQs. Number two, as I said, industry-specific rules. That should be the way forward, because each industry has their own nuances. So while there can be horizontal rules for some of the aspects, some exemptions or otherwise should be, industry specific. And third is that, as Ashish mentioned, not immediate implementation. There should be internal kind of guidance to the ministry and the board as to be more collaborative in terms of, so when I say rules, I'm talking more internal rules to the board,
Right.
to say that, what should be the approach, because unless they have a good SOP in place, you're likely to have very haphazard action. So it is equally important to have internal SOP for the board to implement the act and the rules.
Thank you. I had assured you that we'll overshoot time, and we did. So on that, at least we managed to meet expectations. Hopefully on the other aspects as well, we managed to answer some doubts that people might have had. The one thing that we again assure you is that it's very ambiguous at this stage. So there will be a fair amount of discussion as we move forward. With that, over to you, Saheli. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Indranil. Thank you, Gowree, Ashish, and Bibhav. I just maybe step in front for a picture.